Okay. Well, welcome to the Oneida Community Mansion House. My name is Tom Geiler. I'm the Director of Museum Affairs here. For those of you who've never been here before, welcome. Hopefully, it's not your last time. But this is uh, welcome to everyone on Zoom, everyone here in person, and thank you to the Erie Canal Museum for bringing this wonderful program to us. For those of you maybe unfamiliar with the Mansion House, this was the home of the Oneida community, one of the most radical and longest lasting 19th century communes that transformed into the global silverware company that we all know and enjoy today. The Mansion House, since um, since 1862, has been a number of things throughout its existence. Today, it's a National Historic Landmark and museum that interprets the community and its legacy for people today to imagine a better world to live in. It's also overnight guest accommodations. We have 14 guest rooms, and we also host various lectures such as these, but also concerts and other events. And finally, it is a home. It's been a home since 1862 to many residents. I just want to plug a couple very exciting on August 30th. So September 30th, we're doing the Oneida Quest, which is a scavenger hunt throughout Oneida, and you can learn about history and get a prize at the end. So do check our website for that. Also, October 25th, we have an overnight guest experience where you have a night at the museum in some ways. We're going to do a tunnels and towers tour in the evening, and then the next morning after breakfast, we're going to do a cemetery tour. Later that weekend, on October 27th, you can make it a whole weekend with us. We have Vance Gilbert performing, who's a great singer-songwriter. And for those folks that are interested in quilting, we have two quilting retreats in January, so you can come and quilt in the iconic Big Hall. And stay tuned for more tunnels and towers and after dark experiences. We'll be dropping a few more of those. They sold out very quickly, so hopefully we can get some more people here for those as well. Um, Folks, before I introduce Natalie, people may be asking, this event is quite unusual in some ways as we're hosting an Erie Canal Museum talk, but I feel like we are all kindred spirits here because I think the Oneida community isn't here without the canal. Both bringing people from Vermont here, but also the ideas that were being exchanged here at the community about religion and reform. We're going back and forth across the Erie Canal for decades. So, without further ado, I will introduce Natalie Stetson.
Hello, everyone, and thank you. My name is Natalie Stetson. I'm the executive director at the Erie Canal Museum in Syracuse, New York, so not too far from here. Thank you so much for joining us for this very special program. If you are interested in learning more about the Erie Canal Museum and our upcoming events, including our monthly Sloan Fund lecture series, which are all offered virtually, so if you can't make it to Syracuse, you should visit our website for that info, eriecanalmuseum.org. But we're here because we were delighted to have partnered with the New York State Canal Corporation to host the 2024 Artists in Residence. Besides Clara, who will be speaking today, we have two other artists completing residencies. The first is Alon Kopel, who's completing a re-photography project looking at historic photographs of the canal and re-photographing them in the same location today. And then Judith German Heinz, who is taking tintype portraits of women who work directly with the canal in some capacity. All three artists were asked to create projects that are a creative inquiry of the canal and consider a fuller, more complete account of the canal's past and present than what has traditionally been told. The projects reflect upon the canal's physical environment and social condition and history, materiality, and context. Stay tuned for more information about a joint exhibit that the three artists will be having in Syracuse in early 2025. But today, we're so lucky to have Clara Riedlinger among the 2024 artists. She is a photographer and filmmaker born and raised in Rochester, New York. She received her BFA in film and video art from the Maryland Institute of College of Art and earned her MFA in film production from the Rochester Institute of Technology, where she currently teaches live action film production. Clara has been an avid photographer from an early age after watching her father operate his 4x5 field camera in the family's backyard. He gifted her his 1970s Canon F1, which is an excellent camera, and she has seen the world through the lens of a camera ever since. She's a fifth-generation Finger Lakes resident and is deeply inspired by this unique landscape. I'll let Clara tell you more about her work and her residency project, which focuses on spiritual history of Western New York, known as the Burned Over District. Please join me in welcoming Clara Riedlinger.
All right. Thank you, Natalie, and thanks everyone who's here. Thank you also to the Oneida Community Mansion House and the Canal Corporation and the New York Power Authority. So many people coming together to make this all happen. But I'm just gonna kind of launch right into this. Like Natalie mentioned, I grew up in Rochester along the Erie Canal, maybe about a mile within walking distance of the canal. Spent a lot of time there as a kid, and was always interested in this sort of weird history, or things that might have been overlooked or unseen by people who were just passersby. I always wanted to go deeper with it. And when I first learned about the Fox sisters in particular, which I will get to more of in a moment, I just became hooked on this story of the burned over district. And I started learning more and more about all of the different types of people and their beliefs and these ecstatic religious experiences that people were having all across Western New York. And it made me think that perhaps there was something particular about this place that made it more prone to those types of experiences, or perhaps more magnetic to the types of people that would have those experiences. So this project really explores what it is about the landscape that made that happen, and what happened with the historical context, social context, economics, politics, philosophy, that made not only New York State what it is today, and not only the canal region, but really all of American culture as a result. I need my mouse back over here. Okay, great. So let's see, all I can see are Zoom controls right now. I'm gonna move some things around, get to my presentation. All right, so here we are. So this actually is one of the most recent images that I've made for this project. And it is the furthest east image as well. So this is actually a lock on the Mohawk River at Mohawk Gap, right where the Hudson River and the Mohawk River meet. And where the Mohawk Gap exists is one of only three waterway crossings of the Appalachian chain. So it was one of the only points that allowed people to take animals and carriages, and therefore goods and things that they could actually live with across the Appalachian Mountains. And this is really the beginning of the American frontier as a concept. And being able to carry, oh my gosh, to carry goods across this gap and across the mountains is what opened America up to what would eventually become American capitalism. And after they reached this point, after people reached this point along the Mohawk River, the rest of New York State was pretty unnavigable. So there's the continuous mountains, Catskills and the Adirondack Mountains that converge here, as well as the Finger Lakes and various other waterways, waterfalls, and treacherous terrain that made it highly unlikely for anything to get across to the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River. So what a great idea it would be to have an inland waterway, perhaps a canal would help us out there. But this to me is really where this story starts. So I'm going to start way back. Here you can see on a map this marker here. Sorry, still getting used to where my mouse is going to go. So that's where this picture was taken. You can see the confluence of the Hudson River right here. This gap in the Appalachian Mountains. So just so you can see on a map what I am describing. So this is sort of the end of the Mohawk River as it is now, where it converges with the old Erie Canal. So already kind of thinking about moving waterways, moving land, and reshaping the landscape to be something that people can use to our advantage. So the old Erie Canal was built right along the Mohawk River. Of course, now we have the barge canal, but this is remnants of the old Erie Canal right where it goes into Oneida Lake. So this is sort of present day what things look like. Previously to this, people would have had to navigate Wood Creek, which I sort of attempted to do earlier today and actually slipped right into the creek and got soaking wet up to my neck. So photographs of that to come. But this is getting up to Sylvan Beach. So before the canal existed, there was no way to reach the Finger Lakes other than indigenous people using shallow canoes to navigate Wood Creek. So this gave people access to the Finger Lakes region and the Great Lakes region via some early canals. And this is what's there now, Sylvan Beach Amusement Park. I don't need to worry about people seeing me. I wish the projector was a little bit darker so you could really appreciate treasure land here. But I started to become really interested in these spaces that almost looked like they were out of time. Because part of what captivated me about this landscape and about the religiosity, spirituality, and mysterious nature, I would say, of the landscape is that it feels here like anything could happen at any time. You can see what it was like for people in, 1790, which I will time travel us back to momentarily, or 1950 or 2000, and sort of be in these places and in these times all at once. And something about this Sylvan Beach amusement park in particular feels rather haunted to me. So this now is where the current present day barge canal meets Oneida Lake. But like I said, we're going to travel back to 1790 for a moment. So prior to the canal being built, New York State only went up to what we now call Preemption Road. So you can see that on the map there. And right at this time, I would say probably what I would consider the first moment of the burned over district occurs, which is the Public Universal Friend, formerly known as Jemima Wilkinson, who was born in Rhode Island. She, still living in Rhode Island, has a really intense fever, maybe dies, maybe comes back to life. And when she is revived, at that point says, I am no longer Jemima Wilkinson. I am now the genderless embodiment of God, the public universal friend. And Jemima Wilkinson had been raised as a Quaker, and most of the public universal friends' beliefs followed Quakerism for the most part. But they decided to take a group of followers off to the westernmost point of New York State at the time and set up a mill site. And so Preemption Road at this time went up to from Sodus Bay. So here's some images of Sodus Bay and Chimney Bluffs, which was also another site of an early sort of communal living experiment, but they weren't necessarily religious. They were a particular brand of French communists, but a different thing entirely. So this is where Preemption Road begins, and it follows Route 14 to Geneva. So this is the north end of Seneca Lake here, and then sort of veers off to the west just ever so slightly. So this is that furthest west point which at the time was called the Friends Settlement. So Jemima Wilkinson, now the Public Universal Friend, sets up her settlement here, their settlement. And at the time is the largest settlement of people, of non-Indigenous people in the western section of New York State. But somebody found that there was an accident of surveying, and that the line that they had drawn for Preemption Road was 3 miles too far west. So they move the line back east, and they tell everybody living at the Friends Settlement, which was almost 300 people at that time, and it spanned from what is now the town of Dresden, New York, almost to Penyan, to this mill site, which now is this lovely beaver dam. And they said about half of the houses in this settlement are in the Phelps and Gorham Purchase, which at that point was owned by the Massachusetts Commonwealth. And they said, you will have to repurchase this land from Massachusetts in order to continue living here. But they didn't have any money left, and people did not really like the Public Universal Friend because they had some rather radical ideas, like not being racist and being friends with the Indigenous people, and other radical things like that. So instead, they left and moved to what is now Jerusalem, New York, where the Public Universal Friend built a new house and is buried there in an unmarked grave. It's now a private residence. And this stretch of land, this contested, unsurveyed stretch of land, is now called the Gore, which I think is a really creepy, fun name for it. But this is what it looks like. It's really exceptionally beautiful. So in let's see, I think it was sort of 1790. So by 1796, they are out of there. And about 20 years later, further north, we have the conversion of Charles Finney occurring in Adams, New York, which is right at the southwestern foothills of the Adirondacks Mountains. He was not a religious man prior to this, but at the time there were a series of itinerant preachers traveling throughout the state, and so it would have kind of been in the air. And he has this vision that the Spirit of God is physically coming into his body and possessing him. And this is sort of the first experience of what we would call like a born again Christian. And they had some ideas about Christian perfection, that once you had been converted, you could no longer sin. And they also believed in the coming millennium, that there would be 1,000 years of peace, and then Christ would come back down and usher everyone into heaven. And this becomes important momentarily. So this photograph was made near Adams, New York, near where Charles Finney was converted. It's now Route 11. And this is an entirely different evangelical offshoot that has set up this billboard here, but I just found it to be really interesting that this particular piece of land in this area still has these ideas swirling around in it, and that so much of the language that gets used is so bodily. Like if you read Charles Finney's descriptions of his conversions, it's like highly sexualized. And I think all this talk of like blood and body and birth is like so physical in a way that a lot of religion is not, or you don't think that it is. So this kind of language is just totally fascinating to me. So at the same time that Charles Finney has his conversion, the Smith family of Joseph Smith has just moved from Vermont to Palmyra. So we have a lot of people at this time moving from New England, particularly Vermont and Connecticut and Massachusetts, into this area where land is really, really cheap because they have not yet opened the canal. There are no markets of any sort, so land is readily available. And the Smith family had suffered a series of financial failures in New England, including the year without a summer after a massive volcano eruption caused snow to fall in July because the skies were so dark, and there were crop failures for everybody. So they were out of money. They moved to Palmyra, and they again have a series of financial disasters. They built this homestead. They cleared out all the land within just a few years, and eventually have to sell their mortgage again, and have a landlord where they're renting the home that they physically built, because of all these crop failures, or because of their own ineptitude at farming. Who's to say? And so at the time, the way that this family made money, or one of the ways that they made money, and this was a fairly common occurrence, was by selling services as treasure hunters. So Joseph Smith, along with his brother and father, would use seeing stones inside a hat. They'd put the stone in a hat and then look into it the same way that you can sort of close your eyes and see all the swirls behind your eyelids. And they would use that to find treasure buried on people's properties. So again, they have these itinerant preachers who are traveling around, series of financial failures, and Joseph Smith begins to have a series of visions that a beam of light is entering into his home and giving him religious instruction. So he's maybe 13 or 14 when he first starts to have these visions, and they last for years. And then when he is, I think, 17 in 1923, he has the first vision that the angel Moroni is visiting him and gives him a series of instructions on where to find golden tablets that will reveal the truths of Christianity and the world to him and to all. But in order to get them, he has to complete a series of tasks. One of which, the most important of which, is to climb the Hill Cumorah annually. And he does that for 5 years. And the Hill Cumorah is like not close to the Smith family homestead on foot. It's about 3 miles away. So, only takes a few minutes driving wise, but when you're there walking, it's kind of incredible that he did this. So he walks up to the top of the Hill Cumorah, and each time is told, "You're not ready yet. I'm not going to give you the golden tablets." Eventually, he gets to the top after doing this for 5 years in a row, and is given a special pair of seeing glasses with the seeing stones in them that will allow him to decipher these tablets that are in a treasure hunter type of box. So he says, and I will make no claims here nor there. So he receives the golden tablets and begins the work of translating them along with a couple of other people that he works with and splits up with for various reasons. Eventually, he brings those translations to the Sacred Grove, which this image on the right, which is very difficult to see in this sunny room, but is probably nice and easy to see it for the people watching online. So this image on the right here is the Sacred Grove, where he reveals his translations, which become the Book of Mormon. And so, being in this place, like, I really want to be open to the kinds of experiences and seeing the world through the lenses of the people that were there and having those experiences at the time. And this particular place really is awe-inspiring. So, it doesn't seem like a stretch once you're there that someone would feel awestruck and need a way to explain it. So here again, we have the old Erie Canal. These are a little bit out of order. So just a few years later, August 1831, we're going back south to Dresden, New York. So these are somewhat more in chronological order of the experiences that people were having, but I just wanted to emphasize how close in time all of this was occurring. So a guy named William Miller begins his preaching career in Dresden, New York. So this photograph was made near the Keuka outlet onto Seneca Lake, which is also now almost 100 years past the Friends settlement, but this would be near where the original Friends settlement would have been. William Miller begins his preaching career here, and he is truly the first evangelical preacher. So I mentioned Charles Finney prior to this. Charles Finney learned his trade of preaching from William Miller. And they are sort of the first people to evangelize on the idea that you could be free from sin if you just accepted Christ, and then it would be impossible for you to sin after that. And that it was our duty to create a perfect, sinless world in order to usher in the new millennium. And they hosted a series of camp meetings, which really camp meetings were occurring all over the country at this point. But in particular, the ones in Western New York involved mostly women having these dramatic emotional conversions, where they would just be so overtaken and overwhelmed with spiritual energy that they would scream and cry and laugh. And one of the largest ones was held with wasn't William Miller himself, but he and Charles Finney and a number of other people had pamphlets that they published and magazines where they would present their beliefs to anyone willing to read them, and where they would advertise these camp meetings. And the publisher of one of those magazines was sort of the celebrity preacher who hosted this particular camp meeting in Rochester in 1843, where there were nearly 3,000 people gathered in this space, which is now a parking lot. But this building back here was an Athenaeum. Here, I'll point with my mouse. This building was an Athenaeum, and also later became the home of the North Star printing press. So very storied building here. But there were 3,000 people outside, and every room in this building was full of people constantly praying during this camp meeting. And this is right along the banks of now just the Genesee River, but also just directly adjacent to the aqueducts where the canal originally crossed the Genesee River. So there's all this sort of spiritual, or at the very least emotional energy occurring at the point where these two waterways meet. So also at the time, before the canal, Rochester was kind of like just a nothing little town. There, just a few dozen people living there. When the canal comes through and when hydroelectric plants are installed for mills along the Genesee River at Lower and Upper Falls, all of a sudden Rochester becomes the first boom town. So that's how we get 3,000 people all under a tent in Rochester. So these two images, we have sort of the aqueduct on one side and the hydroelectric facility, which was at one point mills and still a hydroelectric plant along the Genesee River. So this is a driving park bridge. Just another sort of magnificent landmark in Rochester. Now, like I mentioned before, this idea that you can like move rivers and move waterways is really, really fascinating to me, and the way that the landscape responds to that movement. So in the present day, the Erie Canal crosses the Genesee River at Genesee Valley Park. And this is an image at that confluence. And rather than going across on an aqueduct, the canal actually flows right into the Genesee River and then back out of it. So I just loved the way that this tree sort of reflected the idea of a confluence in the split of its trunk. And this tree looks completely different now. I took this image actually a couple of years ago. Like I said, these ideas have been like really percolating in my brain forever. So I started thinking about the ways in which the landscape might respond to human interaction and human energy. The idea that the canal itself is both a man-made artificial commercial thing, but it is also a natural habitat, and the mix of industry and nature and human life being sort of right in the middle of those two things is really, really fascinating to me. So I wanted to try to make images that expressed that spirit coming through them. So here's two images. The one on the left of the canal sort of as this natural habitat, doesn't look man-made at all. And then the image on the right of the Genesee River, right where that hydroelectric facility is, but this beautiful light just feeling like it's almost alive or electrified itself. Also, just before all of this had happened, some scientists in Italy had reanimated a frog with electricity. So ideas about life and death were like the gray area was ever expanding at this point. Which brings me to my next slide here. This is a small pond that is right near the original site of the Fox family home. So speaking of the line between life and death getting blurrier and blurrier, in March of 1848, so we've now progressed another almost 20 years. The canal has been open for 23 years at this point. The Fox family, like the Smith family, had moved from New England after a series of financial failures, hoping to access the markets that the canal had opened up. They did travel along the canal at various points, both to reach this location, as well as once Margaret and Katie Fox began performing their public seances, they took the canal to Rochester several times and eventually moved to Rochester. So they bring spiritualism to life. I don't want to say that they invent it, but they sort of do. They are the progenitors of it. This idea that there are no dead, that they have simply moved on to a different stage of life, and that we can communicate with them through various means. Often photography and electricity, as well as the knockings and raps that the Fox sisters became famous for. So rather than photographing the literal structure of their home, which the foundation of that home is still preserved and you can go visit it. I really wanted to put myself sort of in their shoes and what landscapes would they have been walking through at the time and what would it have looked like. So this is a space right along the banks of the Erie Canal, sort of between Macedon and Palmyra. And I love the way it's this also sort of in between space where these trees appear dead, but there's so much life happening in it as well. And that, again, it's this sort of man-made environment that would not exist without human intervention, and yet the ecology of it is completely wild and natural now. Okay, so that same year, 1848, this is a picture that I took that fateful day when I first came to the Oneida Mansion House, and there was about 2 feet of snow and whiteout driving conditions, but I just had to take one outdoor picture at least. So this was it. So in 1848, John Humphrey Noyes moves the very, very early, I think it was only 6 people originally. So 3 couples that had all decided to have one communal family were driven out of Pulteney, Vermont, and settled here in Oneida and built the Oneida Mansion House. So this, not the very room that we're in, but the very building that we are in. I really wanted to create images here that had some kind of loose narrative feeling to them, that you could imagine almost the sound of footsteps walking through this door. And who might that have been? Who would have sat up in this balcony or on the benches in the back there? I always love thinking about who would sit in the back versus who would sit right up front. So this place was one of those early experiments in communal living, but also, dissimilar from the people that I mentioned who had set up camp sort of in Sodus Bay with their communist experiment. The Oneida community being explicitly a religious communal experiment, sort of hearkening back to Millerism with William Miller, who I had mentioned, and Charles Finney. John Humphrey Noyes had been a follower of Charles Finney, and they had been preaching the end times, right? That the millennium would come in 1843. And that obviously did not happen. And they called that the Great Disappointment. And there were various different responses to it. And one of the responses was that the millennium had actually already come. We were already living in it. And we just had to create this perfect community in order to usher it, to be ready for salvation, essentially. So this was an attempt to create that perfect community. And this is like probably my favorite colors of all of the images that I've taken. So I love what Kate here told me about the kitchens, that there were no stoves in the kitchen, that they were just a place to hang out and chat, but otherwise all meals were taken communally. So this next slide here, so the way they all made money was at first by creating these traps. So if we remember way back to the beginning of the presentation, that image of the Mohawk Gap being sort of that first entry point, the very, very beginning of American capitalism as it made it possible for goods to travel westward across the Appalachian chain. This was a very early example of mass production, starting with animal traps. Although it might be a stretch to call it capitalism because they were sharing everything. But just this idea that anybody could make a business out of something, and especially if that could be mass produced, and if it could be mass produced in service of religion, even better. So here is some of those traps. And I just really love how electricity plays into all of this. So this image, I actually took this picture not near Oneida, but while I was riding the Sam Patch in Pittsford. And so I mentioned the Italian scientists that had brought the frog back to life. Messages are traveling faster than they ever had before. The telegraph comes into play at this time period, and ideas are just traveling at a crazy speed that nobody was used to. And one of the things that fascinates me most, I think, about John Humphrey Noyes is his ideas about like I don't know how to say this other than building a sex battery. That like the more sex that people could have, the closer they would come to salvation. So these ideas about electricity and power and an eruption of spirituality are all so intertwined in a way that I'm just totally entranced by. All right, so we're moving down the canal slightly eastward. At least I hope I have my directions right. We're still in the realm of spiritualism here, back with the Fox sisters. So as the Oneida Community Mansion House that we're in now was communally designed by all of the people that had come to live here. We have this other magnificent piece of divine architecture, the Spirit House. So this was designed and built by a man who received instructions from the other side. He was a spiritualist follower, believer, and he received messages and instructions on how to build this house, which has all of these really intricate carvings around it, and had all of these rooms inside it that were made for ghosts and spirits themselves to live in tandem with the people who would be living and visiting there. And when I photographed this house, I started to really think about the idea of private property, which of course brought me back to the Oneida community because they did not believe in private property. They shared everything. But when I attempted to photograph this house, there are signs everywhere and all over the farms and other like wooded areas around it that say private property, no trespassing. So the more places that I attempted to access to photograph, the more resistance I encountered. And it made me think about, who is in charge of controlling this history and the landscape and where history is expressed through landscape. That, it might be public history, but the locations are privately owned. So I started taking photographs of private property and no trespassing signs as well. So this one on the left here is nearby the Spirit House. And I love the way the yellow of the private property sign reflects the wildflowers there. I just think there's something like really, really, I've never seen a more beautiful no trespassing sign. So I love that image. And the one on the right is back in Macedon along the Empire State Trail that of course runs just about parallel almost the entire length of the canal. But in order to get to this spot, I first had to encounter this very, very faded no trespassing sign that interrupts the Canalway Trail. And there is a privately owned resort on the other side of these woods. So my path was kind of stopped there, and I wanted to get to the other side of the canal to photograph it. And in order to do that, I had to cross some train tracks, which is very dangerous, and you're not supposed to do that on foot. And And there was yet another private property, no trespassing sign, because the railroad company owns the railroad tracks. So there are all these sort of interruptions in public space that I was encountering where I was maybe not allowed to go. And this is another image of Seneca Mill in the Gore, that other initial contested missurveyed space where people were told that they were not allowed to be there and that they had to pay money to this state-owned company. It was a private company that was being operated by Massachusetts that owned this land, and they were told you have to get out, all the way back in 1790. Which made me even more curious about the spaces that I could find where the spirit of the landscape itself was going to override those borders. So this image was made on Troop Street, which is where the Fox sisters lived in Rochester, right off Plymouth Avenue. And I love that you can see that this tree has been here since before the fence. The tree was here before any of these property lines were divided, and it is going to express itself in the way that it's going to grow, regardless of these sort of gridded out borders. Here also, we have this foundation of something left over at Lower Falls. And something about that sort of like human design interrupting nature struck me as almost opposite of how I felt about the canal and how I saw the canal being expressed through nature. So these images, the first one is right along the banks of the canal in Newark, New York. It looks completely different to me than how I would expect to see a New York State landscape, and yet here it is with these magnificent wild cherry blossoms. And then on the right side is actually, I think I misspoke. The Mohawk Gap was not my furthest east picture. This one is. This one was in Albany. So I went further than my Western New York representation, but this is in a park designed by Frederick Law Olmsted, who had some really interesting ideas in the 19th century about human and nature as collaborators in designing the landscape, which I think both the canal and the Olmsted parks, which coincidentally, the canal and the Genesee River also cross in an Olmsted designed park now. I just found those to be really, really interesting. And so I started to try to find more and more images that I could make where nature is sort of almost defying our expectations of it. And maybe my favorite set of images here, these swans in the canal, that classic green color, which is like maybe not the most inviting color for water to be, but is like a very comforting color to me, having grown up on it. And these swans just look they look like they are following a different set of instructions from the rest of us. They like just what a wonderful, mysterious little dance they're doing. So that's it. That's my talk. I don't know that I have any broad conclusions to draw at this moment. I still have a third left of the year to continue this project, and a number of other sites that I want to visit to help solidify some of these ideas. But I guess I'll open it up to questions. Oh my gosh, and what perfect timing, 5:51.
I have a question.
Yeah.
You had an image at the Gore that was where the woman who came from Rhode Island was buried in an unmarked grave. Did you have to work like with the property owner to capture the images, or did you
So
stay on
that,
the computer?
I stayed on the street, for the most part. There are a few sites like here at the Mansion House and, a couple of other spots where I knew people that I could go into private buildings, but for the most part, I stayed on the street. And I am really more interested in the landscape itself, um, rather than any one particular building. Um, unless it was, unless the architecture of that building is related to an expression of spirituality and landscape. So the Mansion House falling into that, having been communally designed to express their particular beliefs, as well as, the Spirit House, which unfortunately I was not able to go into because they didn't want me to. So I stayed outside for that one. Yeah.
I guess my question, so I've visited Palmyra a few times and been to the Smith homestead. And it's a fascinating site because the house is a reproduction. Right?
Sort of, yeah. It's kind of like just a shelter around the foundation.
Yeah. And so the way it was explained to me, this is a quick aside.
Yeah,
Even though this is mostly reproduction, you're in the same airspace
yeah.
Joseph Smith was in. Is how they frame it.
Not Joseph Smith, the Fox sisters. Oh, you mean the Smith family?
Yes, okay.
Yes. Okay.
My question is like, did you have any problems doing photography?
No, not at all. No, they were just walking around. Everything's totally open to the public, and nobody even like asked any questions. So I think they are set up kind of similar to this, that like anybody can just walk in and they want to tell the story.
One small difference. This is, some years ago.
Yeah.
When we got to the room upstairs, which was Joseph Smith's bedroom, where the light came in, so we all had to kneel.
Yeah.
Yes, that's true. It's very, very small.
We don't kneel here.
Yeah, no, that's true. The Smith family homestead is very cramped and small, and like they were very, very poor and they built it all by hand. This obviously, John Humphrey Noyes had just come into a significant amount of money. This was added on to over the years also.
Four buildings.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's interesting because like when I just commend you for getting pictures of the sacred grove. I mean, people like
Yeah, I did. I had to go very early in the morning. I went twice. I went first very early in the morning and later at sunset. And when I went at sunset, there was actually like a pilgrimage happening, and I wasn't able to get into it. Yeah. Yeah.
This is like, it's a question more about thoughts. So you were talking about how as you travel into these spaces, you're interested in experiencing the landscape that these individuals experienced, but we're talking about 200 years. So when you're in these spaces and you're in these trees, like, sure, trees can live very old, but how do you kind of think about the landscape and how it's changed over the 200 years since these experiences happened?
Yeah. So actually the Hill Cumorah is a perfect example of this. So when they were there, it would have been ancient old growth forest covering, let me see if I can go back to that slide. I don't remember which number it is, but I can get to that. Okay, yeah. So we have this hill that now is totally clear cut, and until 2019 had a massive stage built onto it where they would do the Hill Cumorah pageants. So it looked completely different from this and completely different from how it would have looked 200 years ago. And they have stopped doing the Hill Cumorah pageants and have reseeded the hill with native plants and trees so that it will match the rest of that landscape. So at the time that I photographed it, it was and still is currently, because this was pretty recent, in this really interesting in-between stage where you can see that in the future, it will look how it looked in the past. So it's this funny place where you're sort of moving forward and backwards in time at the same time. So that's really what I want to capture with all of these images, that like this experience of being in the future and in the past in a collapsed moment.
Are there sites west of Rochester that you plan to explore?
Yeah, definitely. So I would say the biggest one is probably Lockport. So part of this whole canal experiment at the time, was that, God had created the Mohawk Gap for us there, and we must continue this journey in order to create perfection in the new world. And the locks at Lockport in particular, being so massive and having such an immense change in altitude in such a short distance, really, I think in a lot of people's minds at the time was a divine work. And the fact that people could all come together and build this piece of architecture that, no one had attempted anything like this at this scale previously, and they were just kind of crossing their fingers that it would work, and it did. Like, that is really, really incredible. So Lockport is I think top of my list for that. I would also love to get into Lilydale and photograph some people there, but the spiritualists tend to be a little bit more closed off. Or not closed, I don't want to say closed off, but they are particular.
I know you concentrated on natural scenes, but obviously you pass through so many architectural sites. Do you have any sense of a mythology of architecture?
I haven't explored that yet, but doing this project has definitely sparked some curiosity about that. And I want to have a mythology of
I mean, the
architecture.
Greek revival is so,
Yeah.
so evident all the way around the canal.
Yeah, and I live in a Greek revival house that is right next to where the old Erie Canal ran, which is now 490 and Clinton Avenue in Rochester. Here I am telling everyone where I live. But yeah, so I think Greek revival, and I had an image in here that was taken in Arcadia, New York, and just this whole idea that they're creating the new Arcadia is definitely very interesting to me.
Another stop you might want to make on your westward journey.
Mhm.
On the museum.
Yeah.
Because that's like makes the whole thing go. Right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And there were some really interesting historical happenings there too.
Are you going to get into Chautauqua at all? And that was a Methodist.
Yeah. Chautauqua is maybe a little further south than some of this happens, and I don't know that it's directly related to the burned over district. But I might make my way there if I can find a
1880s.
connection. Yeah, it's a little bit later. Things are starting to fizzle off by the 1880s. But I like Chautauqua.
Did you ever have any like feelings of spiritual rumbling as you're at the site?
Oh my gosh, yeah, you
Yeah.
can't not. It's like it's incredible. And I will say I'm not Mormon at all. That's the one to me that I can't quite wrap my head around. But being at the Hill Cumorah and like in the sacred grove and walking up it, like you do get this sense that like there is something larger at work. And then I was overcome by emotion at the Fox sisters homestead, there's a small church across the street from it that a woman had lived in who was a spiritualist, and she was a nun, or a spiritualist nun, and she had passed away recently. And some of her friends were there at the Fox sisters' house and at the church, and they had come to visit her. And I really was, I mean, maybe just that story that they were there to visit their friends really struck me. But walking up to the church and her home, and I touched the bricks on the side of it, and it really felt like this jolt of emotion that I couldn't totally explain. So yeah, I would say I definitely have felt and I'm open to feeling that way. I think everyone is capable of feeling that way, I will say. You just have to be open to the weirdness. All right. Anything else? All right, thanks. I will say also, I am planning to walk around the grounds a little bit and photograph. So if anybody wants to walk with me, you're welcome to, as long as you stay out.
What form will your final project take?
Well, I'm hoping that it will be a book. I would love to be able to publish this as a monograph, and then definitely there will be an exhibition at the Everson Museum.
Right.
Yes. All right, great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
you.
Thanks, everyone.